Batoche Museum visit May 2026. The Batoche Museum and the plaque at the entrance. It reads, in 1872, Xavier Letendre de Batoche founded a village at this site where Métis freighters crossed the South Saskatchewan River. About 50 families had claimed the river lots in the area by 1884. Widespread anxiety regarding land claims and changing economy provoked a resistance against the Canadian government. Here, 300 Métis and Indians, led by Louis Riel and Gabriel Dumont, fought a force of 800 men, commanded by Major General Middleton, between May 9th and 12th, 1885. The resistance failed, but the battle did not mean the end of the community of Batoche. Historic Sites and Monuments Board of Canada. A standing image of a Métis with his horse. The writing reads, "We left Manitoba because we were not free, and we came here to a country that was still wild to be free." This is a bit false, as several Métis, including Louis Riel, left because they had warrants for their arrests in Manitoba. Louis Riel is one of the most controversial figures in Canadian history. Born in the Red River settlement in 1844, Riel was executed for treason only 41 years later. During his short life, he headed a provisional government that led to the founding of Manitoba. In efforts to preserve Métis rights and culture, Riel led resistances against the Canadian government of the day. The last of these was the 1885 resistance, which ended with the Battle of Batoche, May 9th to 12th, 1885, in Saskatchewan, when Canadian forces launched an attack on 350 Métis and First Nations resistors. After the fall of Batoche, Riel surrendered and stood trial for treason. He was hanged in Regina on November 16th, 1885. Gregory Schofield's poetry collection, Louis the Heretic Poems, included The Sewing Circle, narrated by an older woman to her fellow mothers and wives on the last day of the resistance at Batoche. Schofield is Red River Métis of Cree, Scottish, and European descent, whose ancestry can be traced to the fur trade and to the Métis community of Kinosota, Manitoba. He is a celebrated poet, beadwork artist, and non-fiction writer. Schofield teaches in the Department of Writing at the University of Victoria. Louis, the Heretic Poems, was published by Nightwood Editions, Gabriel Dumont Institute of Native Studies and Applied Research in 2011. The Sewing Circle has been translated to French by Daniel Aubin and is reproduced with permission of the National Arts French Theatre, Théâtre Français de Sienne. This is a very biased sign. The next information sign, a struggle of brave men on both sides. The Northwest Resistance, Rebellion of 1885, was part of the foundation of the Canadian West. Canadians of many different backgrounds have found meaning in the events and personalities associated with it. Was it a legitimate resistance against oppression and threats to cultural survival, or a rebellion against legitimate authority? The struggle meant different things to different groups. A struggle for Aboriginal rights, for French cultural rights, or for minority rights in general, but for others it was the beginning of the West's struggle to become an equal partner within Canada. This sign is very biased. The rebellion was clearly against legitimate authority. a cutout of Louis Riel. The words on the cutout: "We did not rebel, we defended and maintained rights which we enjoyed and had neither forfeited nor sold." Yes, Riel certainly did rebel, and twice, in 1869, 1870, and again in 1885. The next information sign: aftermath. The Canadian government punished the Métis and Plains First Nations, even those who did not support the resistance. Harsh new rules were added to the Indian Act. A pass system controlled movement off reserves, and First Nations farming was restricted. Hundreds were displaced, dozens were imprisoned, and several were executed. This sign is a completely false narrative. Natives were returned to their reservations, and those who actively participated in the Cree and Assiniboine actions at Battleford, Cut Knife, Frog Lake, Fort Pitt, Loon Lake, and Frenchman's Butte were clearly arrested for crimes such as arson and theft, along with treason. Those 8 men who were executed were tried and convicted for murder outside of the military conflict. Each were individually proven guilty in a court of law. Many Métis were labeled rebels. Some families denied their Métis identity. Others moved further north. Aboriginal peoples throughout the West continued to struggle for their rights, but were increasingly limited by legislation, racism, and poverty. This sign is also extremely biased, as the remaining group of 350 Métis at Batoche clearly were rebels. Many of the forces that they struggled against were fellow Métis from Prince Albert and Saskatchewan. These fellows would eventually become the North Saskatchewan Regiment. Obviously, the racism claim is therefore false. Everyone in the West were poor.
Batoche was a vibrant and prosperous community at the heart of the Métis villages of the South Saskatchewan River Valley. Growing from seeds planted during the heyday of the fur trade and the bison hunt, these communities blossomed in the 1870s. In 1885, Major Charles Bolton observed, "They have a fine settlement, comfortable houses, with plenty of horses and cattle. The land is one of the most fertile and beautiful localities northwest of Manitoba. At Batoche, we found some of the nicest houses in the country." Here is a Métis wearing a caribou hide jacket of the type of 1850-1860. Here is La Fauchée in-fire revolver of 1851, and attributed to Gabriel Dumont. Gabriel Dumont was the co-leader of the French Métis here in the rebellion. There's an oil lamp with a reflector and wall bracket, a grave marker retrieved from the Batoche Cemetery in the mid-1950s, where several crosses were replaced by a stone cairn commemorating Gabriel Dumont. Once again, Dumont was the second in command of the Riel Rebellion. It's a fiddle. This is a bayonet trade gun. These muskets were quite effective for the Métis until they ran out of ammunition. Moccasins of the period as well. Roots. Trade was the heartbeat of Métis growth and vitality. During the mid-1800s, the Métis of the Northern Plains dominated hunting and fighting freely in the fur trade. The South Saskatchewan River linked the rich plains and parkland regions and attracted French-Canadian voyageurs such as Jean-Baptiste Latendre to Batoche and his Cree wife, Josephine. They hunted and traded here in the early 19th century and built a small trading post named Batoche, downriver at Muscatine Point. The family later moved to Red River, but continued to trade in this region, as did Métis families such as the Dumonts and Montours. There's an image of Métis at the time. Here is a wooden sculpture featuring major characters of the Second Riel Rebellion, also known as the Northwest Rebellion. Chief Big Bear, Chief Poundmaker were actually not part of the rebellion. They had a separate rebellion. General Middleton was a major part, Riel and Dumont, and the others were minor players. Archaeology at Batoche. In 1869, the Hudson's Bay Company sold these territories to the new Dominion of Canada. Neither party consulted the Aboriginal inhabitants, who greeted the news with a mixture of optimism and anxiety. The Canadian government wanted to create an agricultural society in the West, which could supply food and raw materials to eastern Canada in exchange for manufactured goods. Aboriginal peoples wanted to make sure that there was a role for them to play in the New West. Archaeology again? Not all of the stories of Batoche National Historic Site are written in words. Landscape features, building remains, and artifacts are cultural resources that help us reconstruct and understand the day-to-day life of communities in the past. Archaeologists use many tools, from historic documents to ground-penetrating radar, to investigate these resources. Since 1976, almost 350,000 artifacts have been recovered from more than 60 locations at Batoche. The examples presented here tell unique stories about the different people who have lived here over the past 10,000 years. New communities. The roots of Batoche also lay in the high rudiments of the wintering camps of Red River, Métis bison hunters. In 1868, Gabriel Dumont established a camp at Petiteville, not far from here. 4 years later, he led a group that settled near the Catholic mission of St. Laurent near Duck Lake, where another battle happened. Batoche was also founded in 1872 and soon became the commercial center for the surrounding Métis settlements, known collectively as Saint Laurent or South Branch. These trading and farming communities along the South Saskatchewan River and the Carleton Trail stretched about 50 kilometers from St. Louis de Lomont in the north to Torrance-Coulee, Fish Creek in the south. Fish Creek is the site of another battle. Here is a scene of the Buffalo Hunt. Métis and Cree. Killing and skinning buffalo. Most St. Laurent Métis moved here as families from Manitoba in the 1870s and early 1880s. Many had supported Louis Riel's provisional government there in 1869 to 1870. They wanted to maintain family and cultural connections and to govern their own communities. Some of Batoche's founders were wealthy entrepreneurs looking for better economic opportunities. By 1885, there were about 1,300 Métis in South Branch. Around 500 of them called Batoche home. It was what their farms would have looked like. Gabriel Dumont. As I said before, there were two leaders of the Métis, Riel and Dumont. After helping establish Saint Laurent, Gabriel Dumont operated a ferry and a store along the Carleton Trail near Batoche. His status as a political and military leader grew, thanks to his fame as a hunter and warrior, and to his large extended family. Dumont led the Métis military forces during the resistance of 1885, earning the respect of friends and foes alike. After the Battle of Batoche, he escaped to Montana, but was granted an amnesty by the Canadian government in 1886. After several years as a performer and public speaker in Quebec and the U.S., he returned to Batoche and lived in quiet retirement. Métis land issues. Here's something similar to the same problems that arose during the first Riel Rebellion, the Red River Rebellion. Many Métis had no documents to prove that they owned their river lands. Tensions over land issues in Red River had been been addressed by the Manitoba Act of 1870, but frustration with the implementation of land guarantees encouraged Métis migration westward. In 1878, the Saint Laurent area was surveyed according to the Dominion Lands Grid System, with little recognition of river lots. Here, this is not quite accurate. During the Second Real Rebellion, or the Northwest Rebellion, the surveyors did have leeway to alter the plots to suit the Métis demands and their right of tenancy, or right of occupancy. This is not quite correct here. The government rejected Métis claims of Aboriginal rights. Not necessarily. They had an arrangement, orders to adapt to the claims of land already occupied. The Métis were also refused rights as prior settlers. Not true. All post-1870 settlers were officially supporters. The Batoche area river lots were not officially recognized until 1888. This is a little bit biased. Here are bits of tableware discovered here around the site. A necessary step in developing the New West was negotiating treaties with the First Nations who held Aboriginal title to the land. The government wanted to avoid conflict, but negotiations were undermined by misrepresentations and by misunderstandings on both sides. First Nations wanted to adapt a changing world on their own terms, but the Indian Act of 1876 seriously limited their legal rights and their freedom to govern their own communities. It's actually more about food, with the loss of the major buffalo herds, the amount of food that they were being supplied by the Canadian government due to the Indian Acts kind of pushed them into desperation and into the attacks on Battleford. A Métis women's dress. Red River Card. Hunger in the land of opportunity. Democratic government came slowly to Western Canada, and money was spent on national policies instead of local needs. The free homestead system was too bureaucratic and was abused by land speculators and charlatans. There were almost no roads, and rail construction was slow, despite large public subsidies. Despite a collapsing bison economy, the government cut rations to reduce costs. First Nations tried to farm, but many of the available grains and plants were ill-suited to the region, and equipment was often poor quality. Some had success, but many more followed the dwindling bison herds into Montana. Here's a Red River Cart. The Red River Cart was particularly special in that in times where it was necessary, the wheels would be removed and it could be used as a raft. Here are various arts and crafts and home economic articles of the Métis in this area. They are fun-loving people. Social routines and celebrations were organized around economic activities and the religious calendar. Social events were occasions for fun, food, and music. Batoche was renowned for its dancers, but all of the Saint Laurent communities were bursting with dancers, musicians, and singers. Music and dance reflected the diverse backgrounds of the Métis, who were from French Canadian, English, Scottish, Cree, Ojibwa, and other First Nation heritages. Métis artists adapted these Métis spiritually also reflected diverse traditions. The Métis were mostly Roman Catholic and generally enjoyed good relationships with Catholic missionaries, but they practiced Christianity in their own ways. They placed great emphasis on the personal relationships with God, as expressed in visions and dreams. They often expressed these relationships in communal ways, as in group or community pilgrimages. Métis Christianity incorporated important elements of First Nations spirituality, including spirit helpers and foretelling. Some people attended sweat lodges, and some were pipe carriers, like Gabriel Dumont. Catholic displays. Commercial people. 4 major trails intersected at Batoche, making it a focal point for freighting in all directions. Freighting contracts from the Hudson's Bay Company and local merchants like Xavier Latendre were a major source of income. The local merchant community was small but prosperous. There were 6 merchants in Batoche. Xavier Latendre's house and store were among the finest in the West. His commercial network extended throughout the region, with stores in Frog Lake, Fort Alacon, Stony Creek, and Fishing Lake, and he employed a team of traveling salesmen. More articles. Hearth and home. Métis families' homes were often small, with a kitchen on the main floor, and an open attic space for sleeping and storage. This design came from the tents and cabins used in Métis wintering camps, and reflected the communal nature of Métis life. By the 1800s, prosperous homes were larger and had more individual rooms. They also had more imported furnishings and decorations. Traditional clothing made way for more European styles. With the growth of farming and the arrival of new imported foods, Métis diets became more like Euro-Canadian diets. Although traditional dishes were still prepared, especially for special occasions. The people who own themselves. Many Métis families found prosperity and independence hunting bison. However, the bison population declined rapidly in the 1860s and 1870s. Métis communities began to farm more, but they often lacked up-to-date tools and techniques. Also, good markets were far away and hard to reach. The average Métis farmer farmed between 10 and 15 acres and set aside much more land for horses, cattle, pigs, sheep, and chickens. Drought, hail, and early frosts often hurt the crops, while harsh winters killed livestock. Most families combined farming with hunting, fishing, wood cutting, gathering roots and berries, and casual labor, as they had for generations. More articles found in the area. Petitions and to the Queen. First Nations chiefs demanded better treatment, but the government responded slowly to their petitions. Métis villages also sent petitions to Ottawa, asking for the right to use their lands and govern their communities according to established custom. They were also concerned about French language rights in schools and government, and about political representation. This is a canon of the period used to one of the three canons that they brought, that General Middleton brought to shell the church over there. Here is General Middleton. Once it became clear that there would not be another uprising, Ottawa tried to heal some of the wounds. In 1886, they offered amnesty to those who had taken up arms against the government. The Rebellion Losses Commission examined the claims of people who had lost lost money or property during the conflict, but only if they had supported the government. Several Cree and Dakota leaders were convicted of treason, and 8 First Nations prisoners were publicly executed. That's because they committed murder. First Nations economic opportunities and cultural expressions were severely restricted after 1885. The past system limited their movement off reserves, and new government policies made farming more difficult. In one of Middleton's camps. A bad harvest in 1883 led to high food prices and general misery. Amid a global economic crisis, Ottawa appeared more interested in cutting costs than in helping people. By the spring of 1884, the situation in the West was reaching a boiling point. Moderate First Nations chiefs lost ground to the militants. Frustrated Métis leader invited Louis Riel to Batoche from his home in new home in Montana. He had led the provisional government which negotiated Manitoba's entry into Canada as a province in 1870. This isn't quite correct. He did lead a provisional government, but they were different negotiators representing the Métis who went to Ottawa to negotiate this with Sir John A. Macdonald. This is not quite correct. Hopes that he could win similar political rights for the people of the Northwest Territories soon faded. In April 1885, the federal government formed the Northwest Half-Breed Script Commission. Script was a certificate which could be exchanged for a set amount of cash or land. This was intended to extinguish the Métis Aboriginal land title. Heads of family received script worth $160 or 160 acres of land, and their children received script worth 240 or 240 acres of land. Some Métis used script as an investment. Many others sold it to speculators for less than market value. Corruption and mismanagement were major problems. Although 85% of applications were accepted, 85% of script ended up in non-Métis hands. The last best west. The free homestead system for non-Aboriginal settlers was also open to abuse. Much of the land claimed under those regulations ended up in the hands of speculators as well. Almost half of the people who started out with a free homestead failed to gain permanent ownership of their land. Fear of an Indian war made non-Aboriginal settlers support the government in 1885, but they still demanded reforms. The Northwest Territories soon had an elected legislature and more seats in the House of Commons. However, the region was still dominated by Ottawa and by eastern-based railways and banks. Familiar tale of that period. Here is a diorama of the Battle of Batoche. Here would have been the Métis rifle pits, and here are Middleton's troops advancing. Middleton's troops included many of them were from Ontario and Quebec, but small units came from all across eastern Canada as well, including a detachment from the Princess Louise Fusiliers and the Royal Canadian Regiment of New Brunswick. Bullets fly, blood flows. And behind there is the campaign medal from the Northwest Rebellion. Ribbons of earth tied to the water. The Métis River lock system was adapted from Quebec. full dress uniform and accoutrements, 1885, with the Glengarry cap. That form is a Glengarry. Up here again it says the Northwest Canada Medal, as I mentioned before, awarded to Private William Eddles, E Company, 90th Winnipeg Battalion of Rifles, for active service during the Northwest Rebellion. Here's a New Testament that belonged to Private O.L. Plumes, E Company, 90th Winnipeg Battalion of Rifles, and a Snyder Enfield long rifle, as used by the 10th Battalion Royal Grenadiers and the Midland Battalion during the battle, Ontario soldiers. Darkness falls. Another bad harvest in 1884 led to a very hard winter. Riel consulted with Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal communities, but a consensus was hard to find. Even among the Métis, support for Riel shifted, and families were sometimes divided. In December, Riel and W.H. Jackson of the Northwest Settlers Union wrote a detailed petition into Ottawa. They complained that the people of the West were not being treated with the full dignity of British subjects. Unfortunately, the federal government misinterpreted Riel's motives and underestimated how serious the situation had become. Here is a ration listed. A Snyder Enfield short rifle Mark II, converted from muzzle-loading short Enfield rifle, pattern 1860. Markings attribute this weapon to the 90th Winnipeg Battalion of Rifles. There's a cartridge package, 10 rounds, .577 Snyder cartridges. There's a mess tin with the soldiers ate out of. The billet end was used as a boiler, meat container, and the lid served as a cup. And there's an artillery shell fragment of a 9-pounder common shell coming from that cannon over there, 1885. It was found embedded in a poplar tree at Batoche in 1906. Here's a medicine case, late 19th century. Small arms ammunition box for .577 caliber Snyder cartridges, 500 rounds. And a hold-all, which is just a box. And a diary belonged to Peter Houry of General Middleton's chief interpreter during the Northwest Campaign. The violence escalates. Most Métis, First Nations, and non-Aboriginal settlers stayed neutral. Some Cree and Dakota took up arms. At Frog Lake, 9 people were killed and several hostages taken. The Northwest Field Force came west on the new Canadian Pacific Railway line. An experienced British officer, Major General F.D. Middleton, led over 700 inexperienced Canadian troops to attack Riel's headquarters at Batoche. A force of Métis and First Nations, led by Gabriel Dumont, blocked them at Torrens Coulee, Fish Creek, forcing Middleton to delay his advance for 2 weeks, awaiting reinforcements. More soldiers from eastern Canada. Here is an example of what a Métis soldier would have worn. The dress of the Métis soldiers were generally civilian in style. Factory-produced pieces were replacing handmade items, but distinctive traditional features remain. For example, woven sashes and moccasins and fire bags decorated with glass beads. Here's a bearded woolen waistcoat. Floral styles of beading were common among the Cree and Anishinabek or Ojibwa, and they influenced Métis styles. Here's the uniform of an infantry field officer, undress patrol uniform, as worn by field officers, Major and Lieutenant Colonel of the Infantry School Corps, 10th Royal Grenadiers, and the Midland Battalion. These were boys from Ontario. Infantry officers forged cap, pattern 1876. Cap badge, 10th Royal Grenadiers. The battalion was formed in 1862 and saw active service during the Fenian Raid of 1866. Officer's campaign chair. Here's a field desk. The field desk is a lightweight and portable desks like this were used by officers to prepare orders, reports, and returns in the field, and to store writing materials and stationery. Red tunics were going out of fashion, or out of use throughout most of the British Empire, but Canadian reservists, Canadian militiamen were still wearing it. Here's the infantryman's full dress uniform and accoutrements as worn by the Infantry School Corps, 10th Royal Grenadiers, and the Midland Battalion. Helmet, universal pattern, 46th East Durham Battalion of Infantry. The 46th Battalion contributed D and E companies to the Midland Provisional Battalion. They guarded the system of trails, waterways, and rail lines linking the base of operations to the fighting troops at the front. Here's a knapsack also. It contained the soldiers' spare clothing, shoes, cleaning materials, and personal belongings. With helmet of soldiers serving at the time. The lights go out. Riel changed his strategy. On 19th March 1885, the feast day of St. Joseph, the patron saint of the Métis, Riel formed a provisional government. Once again, that means he's not a confederation leader. He made his own country again. So, provisional government, which is not the recognized government. Gabriel Dumont was named Adjutant General and head of the army. Riel drew up a Bill of Rights for all residents of the West, addressed issues of land, timber rights, responsible government, land speculators, schools, and hospitals. There was no compromise in sight. Métis and Cree, led by Dumont, defeated Northwest Mounted Police and civilian volunteers in a bloody skirmish near Duck Lake. The government sent in troops, and everyone in the West had to choose sides. The end of resistance. The residents of Batoche and the surrounding communities hid in the nearby hills, suffering from hunger and exposure, while militia troops looted their personal belongings and cattle. Riel escaped but gave himself up 3 days later. Dumont and other Métis leaders escaped to the United States. Defeat at Batoche spelled the end of Métis resistance, but some First Nations bands held out until early July. Here's a bridle, circa 1870. Read other articles for riding horses. Métis weaponry consisted of the soldiers' personal firearms, ranging from out-of-date flintlock trade guns to modern breech-loading repeating rifles. Ammunition ran low early in the battle, forcing the Métis to salvage and recast militia ammunition from the battlefield. They were picking up the bullets that were shot at them and putting them back in their own rifles. By the end, many Métis soldiers were firing nails and stones from the weapons. Here, the repeating rifle, your typical Canadian soldier did not have that. So while the Canadian Reserve Militia had a Gatling gun, the Métis, some of them had repeating rifles. Here is a lever action carbine, 44 caliber Winchester, a Northwest trade gun, muzzle loading, percussion, a shotgun, double barrel, breech loading, and Dakota Sioux Warrior of Whitecaps Band. Approximately 20 members of Whitecaps Band fought at Batoche. European-style shirts were acquired through purchase or trade and worn over a breech clout. The leggings, moccasins, and strikolite bag incorporated characteristic Sioux geometric motifs. And last, Riel on trial. For Riel, the resistance had been both a spiritual journey and a political struggle. His words of his trial in Regina emphasized his desire to achieve recognition of Métis or Aboriginal rights and responsible government for the Northwest Territories. The jury had reservations, but quickly returned a guilty verdict. They recommended mercy, but the mandatory sentence for high treason was death. Louis Riel was hanged in Regina on 16 November 1885. After a funeral in Regina, his body was taken to his brother's house in St. Vital, Manitoba, before a requiem mass and burial at St. Boniface Cathedral. St. Boniface Cathedral is, by the way, the beginning of the rebellion in Manitoba, where he made his speech decrying the colonial government, or the proper government of the Lieutenant Governor of Manitoba, William McDougall. More information about the 9-pounder. Over there, the 9-pounder muzzle-loading rifle, A Battery, Regiment of Canadian Artillery. The 105 officers and men of A Battery were regular Army gunners stationed at Quebec City. They fought at Batoche under Captain James Peters. 2 men were killed and 3 wounded during the battle. The battery's mounted division loaded, laid, and fired the field guns. The dismounted or garrison division was equipped as infantry and protected the guns and gunners. A Battery was armed with 2 9-pounder muzzle-loading rifles, capable of firing common shells up to 3,500 yards, or shrapnel shells up to the 2,900 yards. At Batoche, Captain Howard's Gatling gun was also placed under Peters' command. Consequently, Captain Howard wasn't Canadian. He was from